Welcome, everyone. Hello. We are so happy to include you in this Missouri Housing Liaison onboard training. I am Sherry Downing, coming to you from Advocates for Human Potential, and my colleague Ann Denton and I will be providing this series of 6 trainings for you. We're very excited about these. I can say that we probably between us have decades of experience in homelessness and housing, and it is something both of us are passionate about. Would you say, Anne?
Yes, I would. And I would like to, go ahead and get us started by talking a little bit about what you're going to learn. So, as Sherry said, there are 6 modules. We're delighted to be talking to people who are going to be housing liaisons because, as you'll hear as we go through this first module, that housing liaisons and linking people to housing is the probably number one step and a good step for people to recover from the trauma of being homeless as well as homelessness itself. So what you're going to learn in this module is the 5 key principles of Housing First, the benefits of Housing First, which we'll talk about at great length, and then the key elements of a Housing First framework. One of the places that I'd like to start is with the end in mind, which the solution to ending homelessness is housing. And we would like to talk a little bit about, when you talk about the solution, you're also really talking about the cause or the drivers of homelessness. And this most significant driver of homelessness is the lack of affordable housing and the inability of people who are at the lowest levels of income to access the housing that's there. I looked up some of your statistics around fair market rent and what people on SSI make. The deck is stacked against people. And here is one small fact to support that. The fair market rent in Missouri ranges from a lowish of around $570 for a 1-bedroom unit to a high of $795 in the St. Louis area and $1,002 a month for a 1-bedroom unit in the Kansas City area. At the same time, the HUD, the Supplemental Security Income, or SSI, for 2023 is $914 now. That's not going to work. That does not work for people. Even if you're in a rural area and the housing cost is $573, you're still paying more than half of the money that you have for housing. HUD calls that a cost burden. If you're in St. Louis, you're paying, 80% of your income for housing. That's a severe cost burden. And if you're in the Kansas City area, you can't afford it at all. When you look at homelessness through that lens, what I see is that people who are very vulnerable would be unable to access housing and would still experience homelessness, even if they had no vulnerability going into it. The numbers simply don't work. So the key to ending homelessness is housing. There are also other drivers and there are other consequences. And Sherry, do you want to talk a little bit about the experience and the trauma of being homeless?
Sure. I would just add in a little bit of that will maybe add some depth to what Anne said about the importance of your job as a housing liaison. I think one of the really hard things about working on issues of homelessness and working with people who are experiencing homelessness is that they're highly traumatized by the homelessness itself, and often from decades of trauma extending clear back to childhood. But beyond that, we've got sort of a social push and pull that's really hard because people don't want to see it and they don't want to talk about it. And it's way easier to blame people for their own homelessness than to than to begin delving into the really complicated dynamics that land people there. So I think the fact that you see people, that you see them and don't judge them and try to help, is a significant gift. And it takes a really special heart to do that kind of work. So I thank you and commend you for that. But this is a really important piece of your work, is that lack of judgment and that helping hand that you're extending. So thanks, Anne.
Thank you. And the second module, we're going to talk about outreach. And, you know, an example that drives this home for me is an outreach worker who approaches someone who's been drinking. They're not drunk, but they've been drinking, and talks to them. And the lack of judgment that Sherry is talking about is based, for me, in an understanding that the drinking or not drinking is not driving that person's homelessness. It's really not. It's really not. Okay, speech over, at least for now. I wanted to give you a snapshot of some data around homelessness in Missouri. And the data points that we're going to talk about are 2020, 2021, and a little bit from 2022. So this, the source of these data are from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So it's a definitive source. And these are from 2020. So you can see 6,500 people experienced homelessness. That's gone up and down a little bit. You'll see that as we talk further about it. But every community of any size, or the balance of state, which is usually a collection of more rural communities, is required to do an annual point in time count. And in that point in time count, we are tracking and looking for people in these categories. And I just want to point out a couple of them, because the people that we're interested in serving, people experiencing serious mental illness or substance use disorders, are more likely to be overrepresented in the chronically homeless population. They are also may be overrepresented, or at least represented, in the unsheltered group, and may also show up among veterans. So doesn't mean the other people, it doesn't mean our people are not in the other categories. But for me, and for Sherry too, I think when we're looking at a community's data, the number of people experiencing chronic homelessness is a bit of a shorthand to tell us kind of what the level of need is for the services that you, as new housing liaisons, are going to provide. So I won't spend too much time on this. Sheltered and unsheltered is just what it sounds like. The only wrinkle is that HUD counts emergency shelters, safe havens, and transitional housing as sheltered. And then unsheltered is exactly what you would think. People living in their cars, people living in tents. And so HUD keeps close track of that, because the first goal, I think, is to bring people indoors so that they can be safer. And you'll see in a minute that not all of the data doesn't always track in a linear fashion. So these data here are from the 2021 State of Homelessness Report for Missouri. And you had a 30% increase that year in unsheltered homelessness. You also have a pattern where that seems to be across the board. So it's not specific to race, ethnicity, gender, or age group. The interesting thing is when you look at the 2022 data, what has happened in that year, probably a year and a half, is that the new data show a decrease in unsheltered homelessness, which is good, an increase in sheltered homelessness, which makes logical sense. But the scary statistic for me was there was a 96% increase in chronic homelessness. As I just said, many times that's where our target population is. So the numbers are going up and the need for the services that you're going to provide are going up. Just wanted to talk a little bit more about how the deck is stacked. HUD defines different levels of income for households as all around the median family income indicator. And the median family income is the middle income between the top and the bottom. And so HUD has 80% of median family income. So if it, and it is low income. 50% of median family income is very low income, and 30% or less is extremely low income. Guess which group somebody on SSI is in? Extremely low income, right? And so looking at this, they've done an analysis that across the state, there's a shortage of affordable rental homes of 119,000, almost 120,000 short. You're short. And then 68% of extremely low income households have a severe cost burden. It means they're paying way more than half of their income for housing if they can even find it. The other thing that I think speaks directly to the work that you're going to be doing is that the extremely low income bracket is not just filled with people that you're serving. It's not just about people on SSI. You've got people, households on, earning minimum wage or working a couple of part-time jobs. And all of those all of those kinds of households are in the extremely low income category. And everybody's competing for the assisted housing units that are out there. And so your challenge, I think, is to be ready to compete effectively on behalf of the people you're serving. This is more data from the 2022 point in time count. Numbers fluctuate just slightly over each year. But just sort of summarize about the key drivers of homelessness. I mean, I think, and Sherry, if you want to pipe in, we've got the lack of affordable housing and poverty stack the deck. We've got racial disparities, racism, overt racism, covert racism, whatever you want to call it, stacks the deck. And then you've got people who have experienced violence and trauma, stacks the deck.
And I think what I would add to that, Anne, is the vulnerabilities many people who are experiencing homelessness have. So it might be disability, either a behavioral health disability, or we know that people who are surviving without homes often have multiple health issues, COPD and congestive heart failure and diabetes. Those all can, be tied pretty definitively to backgrounds of significant trauma. And so in addition to these drivers that Anna's just described for us, we've got personal vulnerabilities that make everything exponentially harder. Mm-hmm. And so, the deck is stacked. This is hard. So thanks, Anne.
Thank you. All right. So this next section, we're going to talk about addressing homelessness with housing first, but we can't do that without talking about the context in which we serve people who are homeless. And so, Sherry, I'm going to turn it to you to do some talking about how that context works.
You bet. So the continuum of care, I'm sure you've probably all heard about it. The continuum of care was a strategy implemented in 1995 by HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And what HUD asked people to do was submit a single application for homelessness assistance through the continuum of care, which is an organizing strategy to connect all of the programs that are serving people experiencing homelessness into a single continuum. So hence continuum of care. But the intent was to foster community-wide commitment and provide funding in a sort of organized way, a streamlined way, and promoting access to the many mainstream programs that people need when they're experiencing homelessness. And ultimately, what we're hoping is that it will optimize self-sufficiency among folks who are experiencing homelessness. So that's the intent of the continuum of care strategy. It's, I would say, it's a great strategy. It's working well in communities. Another thing continuums of care are expected to do is collect data through the homeless management information system. And each continuum chooses its own. And then that data is all sort of fed in a stream that becomes a river and ends up at the ocean of HUD, which is sort of a poor analogy, but this is important. It gives us tools to work with. And what we know as we work with folks who have high needs, no one program can fix everything. I cannot be a kingdom unto myself with my little program that provides, housing or services or mental health treatment or substance use treatment. Not one program can do it all because people have diverse and extensive needs, and you still need food and clothing and shelter and temporarily, oftentimes before permanent housing. And there's lots of things that are needed, and everybody sort of holds a little piece of this puzzle. What we know about Missouri is that you have several continuums, including a balance of state continuum of care. That includes 10 regions, and then some other COCs include the Greater Kansas City COC Coalition to End Homelessness, which covers Jackson County, Missouri, and the St. Louis City Continuum of Care. So there are several entities that are all working at using this strategy. I personally live in Montana, which is highly rural, and I know that you all have some really rural areas, as evidenced by your large balance of state continuum. And we aren't going to have in rural and frontier areas, we're certainly not going to have every single service we need within a 2-block area. So the continuum strategy in those areas can become a little more complex to implement, and yet it's still an excellent strategy, probably the best we've got. What would you add to that, Anne?
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I'm old enough and have been doing this long enough to remember the chaos that was our attempts to address homelessness before HUD created the continuum of care. Is it a perfect system? Of course not, but it is a structure, and the structure has a lot of local control. So if you have any sort of heartburn around how your local continuum of care is working, you have it within your power to do something about that.
And I think we would both encourage you to get involved with your local continuum. This is important work, and it gives you a voice, and it also gives you an opportunity to advocate for the people you serve, because the continuum is not just serving people with serious mental illness or co-occurring disorders or substance use disorders. It's really serving the whole population of people experiencing homelessness, which could be people fleeing domestic violence. It can be people with significant physical disabilities, people with, who've lost their jobs or lost, have ended up owing a ton of money one way or another and being hounded into bankruptcy. I mean, it can be any one of a number of paths to homelessness, but this continuum gives you a really good opportunity to advocate for the people you serve. So I do think it's important to participate. Some of the agencies that are involved in the continuum are reflected here. I would say that it goes well beyond this, and I think it's important to encourage everybody who's doing some work that contributes to addressing this issue participates. I think the food pantries, absolutely. Drop-in centers, shelters, absolutely. Religious organizations, sure. Health providers and behavioral health providers, and shelters of all sorts, and police departments, and the list goes on. Who is missing from this list, Anne, that you can think of?
Oh, I don't know, but I can tell you that I do know that housing liaisons, you're going to be participating in the continuum of care, whether you're through a formal membership, you know, as a member agency. And I expect that you all of the agencies that you work for are member agencies in the local continuums. You're also going to be participating in what's called coordinated entry. And so that means, you know, part of the work is going to be helping people get entered into that system, because without that coordinated entry and an assessment that goes with it, they become ineligible to access all of the resources controlled by the continuum. You're going to be in it.
And I would just say the continuum does have resources that you need to access on behalf of your clients. And with the coordinated entry system that Anne is talking about, that's a pathway right to housing. You have access to the people who need the housing. The continuum has access to housing. This is an important connection. Oops.
Advanced your slide for you, Sherry, and I should not have.
And I was advancing it at the same time too. So there, we'll stop now. The continuum is reflected through a range of housing programs. These are different models that are employed by HUD, Department of Housing and Urban Development. So it's rapid rehousing, which is just a model that gets people quickly moved into, or people who are at high risk of becoming homeless are moved quickly into permanent housing. And this is done through a temporary rent subsidy and housing focused case management. So it's a great strategy. It's often used for families. Emergency shelter is an important interim piece. We all talk about the importance of housing first, and I love housing first. It's permanent housing first. It isn't housing only, but it is housing first with low barriers and not a lot of entry requirements. That said, it can be difficult to find and access permanent housing. And so sometimes you will need a bridge to that permanent housing, and that can be through emergency shelter, can also be through transitional housing that provides housing for up to 24 months, usually shorter. I think the research is indicating 12 months is pretty much the average. But at this point, the emergency shelter is just temporary emergency shelter. We're all aware of what that looks like. Transitional housing is a little bit more stable because it lasts longer. It gives a little more privacy and authority to the individual or the family being housed. The homelessness prevention is really a great strategy where people who are at an imminent risk of homelessness get housing focused case management and maybe a temporary rent subsidy, the little bits of help they need to stay stable. And those services too are time limited, and the household, and often, not always, but often the household doesn't have to leave their housing space when the services end. So, you know, I would say, and then permanent supportive housing. Anne and I are both huge proponents of permanent supportive housing and work on it in other projects that we do together. But this is subsidized, it's not time limited, it's a low barrier, permanent housing that provides optional, flexible services for people coming out of homelessness who have a permanent disability. Housing First is a great example of PSH. And what would you add? We can both get going on this one.
Yeah. You said it. I mean, permanent supportive housing has been seen and continues to be seen as a really effective, very effective approach for people who are also experiencing, you know, psychiatric disabilities or substance use disorders. And there's data, which we will not be covering in this presentation, to show how effective it is. And I would say that Housing First, which we are talking about here, is a very high fidelity, high quality form of permanent supportive housing.
Absolutely. And these are all kinds of housing that are subsidized by HUD, specifically for people at risk of or who are experiencing homelessness. What we know is that Housing First is not housing only. If you just sort of put people in housing and then say, well, we got our job done, bye-bye, that often is a recipe for failure. That said, you know, with Housing First, and we believe that this is a great model. Support services are readily available and sort of dictated by the individual who needs them. So housing is absolutely necessary for recovery. In Housing First, that includes wraparound, client-centered, flexible services. And people can opt out of services, but oftentimes what that means is that they'll begin having trouble living up to their lease, right? So everybody has things they have to do to stay housed, and it's written out very plainly in the lease, and it's pay rent on time and don't destroy the peaceful enjoyment of the neighbors, and it's don't hoard, and there's all kind of things that fall into that. If people need Housing First, they likely will also need supportive services in housing. And if they opt out of those, oftentimes that gives you a teachable moment and an opportunity to use your motivational interviewing skills to say, you know, maybe we should think about some services. So anyway, Housing First. Housing is absolutely necessary for recovery. It connects people, and we're talking individuals or families. HUD calls them households, but people experiencing homelessness with permanent housing. That is a huge big deal. It's subsidized so that people are paying an affordable amount, which HUD considers to be 30% of adjusted gross. So that's considered affordable. That's what people are expected to pay with the subsidy. There's no preconditions. There's no barriers to entry. Like you don't have to be sober for 24 months, or you don't have to be in an education program or be able to
Sort your laundry.
Exactly, right? So there's no preconditions, such as sobriety or treatment or service participation. Supportive services are offered but not required. This is a wonderful model that really works. Housing First can be a philosophy, a systems approach, a program. It is a spectacularly successful evidence-based practice that gives people their best shot at getting, becoming stable in the community. Anne, you want to add anything to that?
I just want to say what Housing First is not, right? We're going to spend some time talking about what are the key elements or the principles of Housing First. But let me tell you what it's not. It's not, we have to give Sherry housing no matter what, right? It's not, there are, people who come to us and they have significant difficulties, and Sherry may have a cancer diagnosis that requires her, for her own survival, to go away for cancer treatment, to go to the hospital. so it doesn't mean that Sherry comes and says, I want to be in an apartment, and we put her in an apartment no matter what, right? It is about matching people to settings that are totally appropriate for them. So I've heard, because, and that speech started because I've heard case managers say, well, even though Sherry, has all of these other conditions that she needs help with, we had to put her in an apartment first. Actually, no. Our job, your job as a housing liaison, is to work with people to figure out what it is that they think they need from their perspective, and then work with them to also help them identify things that they might not know that they need, and then bring people to housing, but doing it in a way that provides them with the supports that they need and the opportunities that they need to make that housing successful.
Absolutely. And with Housing First, somebody may say, I want to live in recovery housing. Okay. I want to live with a roommate. Okay. I want to live with my romantic partner. Fine. I want to live in, an adult living facility. Fine. Right. There's a lot of personal choice in Housing First. So it isn't just sort of one size fits all by any stretch.
Right. The difficulty with that, though, is that some of those other alternatives are not necessarily, they're not going to count as a Housing First setting, right?
Correct.
So if Sherry chooses to go to an assisted living facility, that is her choice, and that's our job. But it doesn't then count as a Housing First placement, not placement, a Housing First setting.
Thank you. And I should have been clearer about that, but that's absolutely right. But I do think choice is what we're really talking about here. And it is important to honor the individual's choice, the kind of housing that they want.
As Sherry said earlier, this is not easy to do. And I think this first sort of key, the definition of what Housing First is, highlights the difficulty, right? Because you're doing something, if the people that you're helping could have succeeded without you, they would have done that already. So you're working with a group of people who really do need your help. But instead of forcing that help on them, you have to negotiate, and you have to use your skills, motivational interviewing, harm reduction, other skills that you have that you bring to the table. For me, it was the hardest work I ever did.
Absolutely. So what are the benefits of Housing First? And really, I want to just be very clear here. Housing First, the models is looking at permanent, supported. That means there's a subsidy with it, housing for people. They can have it as long as they need it. There are services attached, but they are flexible and voluntary. So what are the benefits? Well, for one thing, it helps people get access faster, because with the Housing First program, typically you've got the connections or, maybe ready access to housing. And once people get into Housing First, they're more likely to stay housed. I think that the research bears out that the majority of people are still stably housed a year down the road.
More than 90%. If Housing First is done right, more than 90% of the people who are served retain their housing at 1 year.
Isn't that the coolest thing ever?
Yeah. And then it's in the high 80s for the second year.
Yes. So these are people who maybe have been homeless for decades, have been experiencing homelessness for decades. And suddenly, and Ann and I, we've done some site visits together. Do you remember the one, Ann, where we went to someone's apartment? He welcomed us in. It was part of the site visit to go see some people who'd been housed through Housing First. And we went in, and it's just, it was modest. It was a modest little place. Remember, it had concrete walls, the big bricks,
Yep.
and a window in the back, a small window in the front, a little tiny kitchen, a little tiny bedroom, and a recliner and an ashtray. And, you know, the
And
air
the
was
TV.
blue and a TV. And on the wall, remember, was that huge, buy them like at gas stations in the summertime, they'll be hanging out, but it's the big velvet wall hangings. And he had a huge one, a Bengal tiger, right? It was immense. And it took up most of the wall. Fortunately, it was a wall without the window. And he welcomed us in. There wasn't a place for us to sit, so we're sort of all standing and gathered around him. And he said, "Look at this. It is the nicest place I've ever gotten to live. And look, I even have art." We were so tickled. I have remembered that. People stay housed. Housing first works. And the people who also receive support services are going to be way more likely to participate in job training or school. Next steps. They're able to start taking next steps. We also know that they begin to reduce substance use. And they become more satisfied with their own lives, with their autonomy and their choice and control. I could go on and on about the benefits of housing first, so I'll stop there. Do you want to add anything?
I just want to summarize by saying that if you want to take a look at the data, look at the research data, there's a lot of it out there, and all of it validates just what we just said. The thing that people don't, are incredulous about at first, but it is strongly supported by the data, is that substance use goes down.
Isn't that
Alcohol use in
fascinating?
particular goes down. Maybe not the first week. First week, somebody's holding a party, but over time it goes down. And so we're really looking at housing first gives people a place from which they then can expand the recovery.
Yep.
So how did all this get started, Sherry?
Well, why did Housing First begin? Well, it started as an alternative to the housing approach where people had to earn housing. So transitional housing back in the day, when we first started trying to solve the issue of homelessness, that became really began to become apparent in our communities in the early 80s, late 70s, would you say?
Mm-hmm.
And at first, people were put into transitional housing, and there were really high expectations of what they would have to achieve before they earned permanent housing.
Right.
And that didn't work really well. I
It
mean,
doesn't work at all.
was-
I mean, one of
Right.
the things about that research that I just made a speech about,
Mhm.
one of the most profound findings, or the strongest findings, is that putting readiness requirements in front of housing does not make any difference to the outcome. So if we have housing for Sherry and she has to go to treatment first and be 30 days sober, it makes absolutely, she might do that. And then we have Sherry's sister, right, who doesn't go to treatment and goes to the same permanent supportive, goes to permanent supportive housing first. And in a year, the prerequisite made no difference to her tenancy. It's not supported by the data.
Exactly.
So, yeah, but I think people get stuck on that in communities because they think, well, it just seems to make, it has what the researchers call face validity. If Sherry's not drinking, she should be doing better. Okay. Well, the truth is that's not borne out in the data. So,
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. The other thing, we've also done site visits to places, and we'll say, "Do you do housing first?" And people will say, "Well, sure, we do housing first. People just have to go to treatment first." It's like, no. With housing first, the housing is really and truly first. It should not be housing only, but it should be housing first. So, meeting specific requirements beyond the natural ones that you find in anybody's lease is not housing first.
So, well, we've talked already a lot about access to housing. So you get access to housing without, what I would call readiness requirements, right? And then, so that's principle one. Principle two is that the person we're serving drives the program, right? They make choices about their housing units. They make choices about the level of services that they receive. The next thing is that this is all about recovery. It's about people recovering their roles in life. It's about people recovering stability in their housing situation. It's about people growing and thriving and getting better. The fourth one is really about doing what I call varsity level services and supports. The job is not easy. You really are selling your services to the people that you're trying to help. And so, if I think that Sherry should go to treatment and Sherry is not interested in going to treatment, then I need to back off and do what needs to be done in terms of helping Sherry retain her housing. And then the biggest benefit of all is social and community integration. People are coming back into the workforce, coming back into social and other kinds of settings that we all enjoy.
Many Housing First programs in Missouri do have some eligibility documentation requirements. That does not invalidate any of the other principles. So
Right.
just heads up on that one.
Yeah, there's a total difference between a readiness requirement, which is you have to be able to cook balanced meals and sort your laundry, right? Or an eligibility requirement that you have to have been homeless for a certain period of time in order to qualify. Totally different things.
Absolutely. So we're going to talk a little bit about supporting the 5 principles. Number 1, the principle is immediate access. I love this, immediate access to permanent housing with no housing readiness requirements. Key concepts: people who want housing are ready for housing. People need housing. Housing is a human right, in my opinion. People deserve a permanent place to stay. Those are the key concepts of Housing First. Some of the key questions that you might want to ask the folks that you're working with are, do you want housing? Can I help you find housing? And what kind of services would you like? What I will say is that we often see people who have been experiencing homelessness, maybe chronic homelessness, which means they've been homeless for at least a year or a significant period of time, and they have a disability. People often become so disempowered that they'll deny that they even want housing. I'm homeless by choice. You'll hear that. We've all heard it. Is it an informed choice? Is it even an accurate statement? I don't think we can make statements for other people. And yet, if I cannot get myself into housing, if I can't, access housing and take care of my own needs, sometimes pride and self-sufficiency and ego will get in the way, and it's easier to say I don't want housing than to say I can't get housing. So I would just say, when we begin talking about these principles, it's important to sort of remember context.
I want to wrap up briefly. The next principle is consumer choice and self-determination. And, when I started as a case manager, we were doing something called psychosocial rehabilitation. And one of the key concepts in that was people vote with their feet. So if we're not providing autonomy and we're not providing choice, many times people will leave the setting because they do not are experiencing that autonomy. Here are some of the questions that a housing liaison, you might think about to inform how you're supporting the principle of choice. And I'm not going to read them all to you, but all kinds of things go into housing and services. And one of my favorites is, do you want a pet? Do you have a pet? Right? Smoking or non-smoking, what kind of neighborhood do you want? All of these things are about what the individual wants. Now, may not be able to provide all those things, but one of the underlying principles here is that we are helping people to feel heard. And Sherry, back to you.
Okay. Principle number 3. It's a recovery orientation. What do we know? As Anne told you just a minute ago, what we've learned is that when people get into safe, stable, affordable housing, they begin to recover. Drinking goes down, use goes down. Those are things that we've learned through the research. What we know, if we look at this through a recovery orientation lens, is that people can recover. People can do well, and they can define their own recovery and achieve their own goals. What's important is that they're their goals. I know we did a site visit one year where we looked at several case files. It was part of the protocol. And every single one of them had the exact same goals written in the exact same language and punctuation.
Mm-hmm.
They were handwritten. It was apparently the same handwriting. It was a huge red flag, right? And why was that a red flag?
Because it is unlikely that people all are saying exactly the same thing in exactly the same words. So the next one is individualized and client-driven supports. And I think what happens here is that many of our systems come with prepackaged levels of support. And it is all too often the case where we feel like those are the services that people need to be encouraged to accept. And what we would tell you is that instead of someone who wanted, somebody who might want to work on, approaching sobriety, or I think Sherry should work on approaching sobriety, and Sherry wants help getting her groceries. We really need to move our services and supports to what the client thinks they need first. And then we can help them think through what's next. And the last one, Sherry.
The 5th principle is social and community integration. And with this one, I think the mindset really needs to be creating space and connection for belonging. People need community. The key concepts are people should live in community and deserve to be welcomed there. And they're helped by their peer connections. And so here are some of the key connections, but really what we need to think about with this principle is creating the space for connection and community. And with that,
we have completed module 1. In the next module, we're going to be talking to you about outreach fundamentals, and we look forward to doing that.